For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass S 3744, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2020.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 3744, an act to condemn gross human rights violations of ethnic Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang and calling for an end to arbitrary detention, torture, and harassment of these communities inside and outside China.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCaw, will each control 20 minutes. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include in the record extraneous materials on S 3744.
Without objection, so ordered.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Should advise the House that we're taking up this bill about an hour and a half earlier than expected, and I hope that our colleagues from the Foreign Affairs Committee have changed their schedule so that they can come and join us to speak on this bill. Let me point out that even in a pandemic, the American Congress focuses on human rights. Madam Speaker, let me start by thanking our colleagues from both sides of the aisle and both chambers for their work on this legislation. I especially want to thank Senators Rubio and Menendez and Representatives McGovern, Sherman, Smith, and Swazi, and others who have worked for well more than a year, well more than 2 years in most cases, to focus the world's attention on the deprivation of human rights in Xinjiang province and to work for an appropriate American response. The Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act is a result of tireless work from so many individuals who focus on human rights. We have seen the reporting, the interviews, the pictures, the documentaries. The evidence is overwhelming. The Chinese government has brutally detained and, quote, re-educated or sought to re-educate over 1 million Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities, chiefly Muslim minorities, in the northwest of China. It is horrific. The goal of this inhumane campaign is clear: to force these minorities to assimilate, to erase all evidence of their unique language, culture, history, and religion. Beijing has relied heavily on technology to carry out this abuse, transforming the Uyghur region of Xinjiang into a surveillance state. But even as the world has learned more and more about the extent of these atrocities, there has been nowhere near enough action. Beijing has leveraged its economic clout to silence criticism and its horrific human rights abuses. So many countries, particularly Muslim countries, that always speak out when any group of Muslims is being denied their human rights, have been pressured into silence. And now China wants the world to forget about the Uyghurs as we grapple with this global pandemic. We must push back. Today we send a message loud and clear. We stand with the Uyghurs. We will fight for the oppressed, and we will not forget. By passing the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act today, the United States takes a meaningful step toward holding the perpetrators accountable. This bill will impose sanctions on those individuals responsible for human rights violations in Xinjiang. It also calls on our government experts to issue reports that can improve our understanding of the situation on the ground. The persecution of the Uyghurs is one of the gravest human rights tragedies currently taking place. We must stand on the right side of history and respond decisively. This legislation is a critical step forward, and I'm proud to support its passage. I hope all members of this body will join with me in that effort, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Thank you, Madam Speaker. The last several months have made it clear to the entire world that the Chinese Communist Party, or the CCP, has little regard for human life. When faced with the decision they have chosen and will continue to choose to preserve their own power over helping their own people. Rather than alert the world to the true dangers of the coronavirus posed to the world, they instead lied and orchestrated the worst cover-up in human history, exposing the Chinese people and the entire world to a virus that has killed over 350,000 people, including nearly 100,000 innocent Americans. Another 5.5 million have been infected worldwide, and those numbers only continue to climb. This atrocity is far from the only example of the CCP prioritizing its power over human life and liberty. At this very moment, the CCP's rubber stamp legislature is working to dismantle Hong Kong's freedoms. Under the guise of national security legislation, the CCP plans to expand its police state to Hong Kong and fundamentally change Hong Kongers' way of life and freedom and autonomy. The CCP is showing the world that they are willing to tear up the international commitments they made to preserve freedom in Hong Kong. We can no longer stand idly by while the CCP consolidates its power at the expense of freedom around the world. The ultimate example of what the CCP is willing to do in the name of national security has been clear for some time, and that is the cultural genocide of the Uyghurs and other ethnic minority Muslim groups in Western China. Over the last several years, these ethnic minorities have been rounded up and forced into concentration camps where they are brainwashed with state propaganda and forced to do grueling work as part of their freedom. They live under a complete Orwellian surveillance program, an apparatus tracking their every move. Some have been tortured and killed. Others have been disappeared from their families, never to be returned with no explanation from the CCP. That is why I stand today in strong support of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. The goal of the Chinese government is to completely eradicate an entire culture simply because it doesn't fit within what the Chinese Communist Party deems, quote, Chinese. They want to remove the cultural, religious, and ethnic identity the Uyghurs have and indoctrinate them so they love the Chinese Communist Party more than their family, their culture, or their religion. In total, 1 to 3 million Chinese citizens have been subjected to the state-sponsored cultural genocide. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has called this the, quote, stain of the century. And he's absolutely right. That is why we can't sit idly by and allow this to continue. And as I've said before, our silence will be complicit and our inaction will be our appeasement. But today we are acting, Madam Speaker, as the beacon of hope and freedom to the rest of the world. And the United States has a responsibility to take action. Now is the time for all of us, Republican and Democrat, as Americans, to stand together and show the CCP that their egregious human rights abuses will not go unchecked. And we can do that by passing this bill today with strong bipartisan support to show the Chinese Communist Party and the entire world that their treatment of the Muslim Uyghurs is inexcusable and will not be allowed without serious consequences. This legislation requires the President to submit a report that identifies Chinese Communist Party officials who have carried out these heinous crimes. These officials may then be sanctioned for their complicity. This bill also requires a separate human rights report that highlights abuses specifically to Xinjiang, China. So, Madam Speaker, I'm hopeful that this is just one of many bipartisan actions that we can take as we push back on the world's most oppressive dictatorship. We must acknowledge that the CCP is the greatest economic and national security threat of this generation. We must face this threat not as Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans. As the chairman of the recently announced China Task Force in the House, I look forward to working with my colleagues to plan decisive action to push back on the CCP. We cannot allow the CCP to remain unchallenged on the world stage. And with that, Madam Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California.
I yield 4 minutes to the Chair of the Rules Committee, Chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, Co-Chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, a man who is known for his dedication to human rights, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern.
Gentleman's recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, today I am proud the House and Senate have come together in a bipartisan way to pass S3744, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act of 2020. This is monumental legislation that provides the administration a clear direction for implementing U.S. policy and sends a clear message that the United States supports the human rights of Uyghurs and other ethnic minority groups in China. Thank you to Congressman Chris Smith, Brad Sherman, Tom Suozzi, and Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall. Thank you for your leadership on this bill. We now believe that as many as 1.8 million Uyghurs and other ethnic minority groups have been arbitrarily detained in mass internment camps and subjected to forced labor, torture, and political indoctrination. In recent months, we've seen leaked internal Chinese government documents that show the scope and implementation of mass internment camps, the mass internment camp system, including evidence that the camp system is organized at the direction of top Chinese government officials, documentation that punishments can be based on the behavior of their relatives outside the camps, outlining the use of coercive force and punishment inflicted upon inmates in a manual, guidance for how Chinese officials should use surveillance to determine who to detain in the camps, and evidence of the assignment of mass internment camp detainees to forced labor. And there can be no doubt that the Chinese government is trying to stamp out the Uyghur identity. The policies of the Chinese government contravene the letter and the spirit of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and violate the government's obligations under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which China has signed but not ratified, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights ratified by China in 2001. It is important to always make clear that our criticism is focused on the Chinese government. We respect the Chinese people, many of whom have suffered from and are victims of the authoritarian policies of their government. Last year, the Congressional Executive Commission on China, which I chair, published a report making the case that the persecution of Uyghurs may fit the definition of crimes against humanity as defined in Article 7 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. In March, the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the Holocaust Memorial Museum also determined that there is a reasonable basis to believe that the government of China is committing crimes against humanity. Passage of the legislation is an important first step, but there is much more that we need to do. First, the administration should impose global Magnitsky Act sanctions on Chinese officials who are directing ongoing human rights abuses, including Chen Chuen-Guo, the Xinjiang Communist Party secretary. Second, the administration should further expand the Commerce Department's entity list, which imposes restrictions on businesses and entities that provide technology, training, or equipment that has been used in mass detentions or surveillance. And third, I've introduced the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, H.R. 6210, that would prohibit imports from Xinjiang to the United States unless companies can prove that their goods were not produced with forced labor. Too many U.S. and international companies are complicit in the exploitation of the forced labor of Uyghur and other Muslim minorities. I'm proud to stand in solidarity with the Uyghur, Chinese, Tibetan, and indeed all the people living under the rule of the Chinese government in their struggle to live freely, practice their religious beliefs freely, and speak their own languages freely. I look forward to the passage of this legislation and continuing our bipartisan work together to support human rights in China. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, the House sponsor of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, and Mr. Chris Smith.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my good friend for his very strong remarks today and his leadership, of Brad Sherman as well, and of course Jim McGovern and I as chairman, and I'm the ranking member of the China Commission, for the work that we've been doing to try to bring light to this terrible human rights tragedy, this genocide that's being committed against the Uyghur people. Madam Speaker, Communist Party General Secretary Xi Jinping's ongoing genocide against the approximately 10 million Uyghurs living in Xinjiang in northwestern China demands action. Today, more than 1 million Uyghurs are in concentration camps. Millions more are harassed, beaten, raped, and tortured. S. 3744, which is nearly identical to legislation H.R. 649 that I and my good friend Mr. Swazi and 136 bipartisan co-sponsors introduced 17 months ago, requires the administration to categorize and report on the human rights abuses being committed by the Chinese government and take specific steps to sanction Chinese officials for these abuses, including visa denial and asset blocking, the essence of the Magnitsky Act, which is the prohibition of all financial transactions by an abuser. Madam Speaker, at a 2018 congressional hearing, Miragel Tursin recounted her ordeal with torture, sexual abuse, and detention in one of Xi Jinping's concentration camps. She broke down weeping, telling us that she pleaded with God to end her life. Her Chinese jailers restrained her to a table, increased the electrical currents coursing through her body, and mocked her belief in God. She was tortured simply because she was an ethnic Uyghur and a Muslim living in China. Madam Speaker, there are millions of stories like this waiting to be told about the crimes against humanity being committed by the Chinese government against Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Turkic Muslims. You know, there are many people, we all know them, I've had them at my hearings in the past, women and men who have had their entire families back in this region, Xinjiang, arrested and put into concentration camps and harassed in other ways. Chinese authorities initially denied the existence of the concentration camps and even tried to portray them as vocational training centers. What a euphemism. They employed lies, censorship, and economic coercion to stifle discussion of their crimes. Where have we heard that before? Look what's going on with COVID-19 and the deceit and the lies that have come from Xi Jinping himself. But documents obtained by the New York Times and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists have indeed exposed the brutality behind Beijing's plans to radically and coercively transform the culture and religion of ethnic Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and other Muslims. The leaked documents showed detailed plans to intern between 1 and 3 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, where they are subjected to severe human rights abuse and Orwellian indoctrination efforts for those whose thinking, quote, has been infected. That is to say, they're Muslims. And to Xi Jinping, that is something that needs to be obliterated. At the same time, Beijing instituted plans to erase the influence of Islam in Western China, bulldozing mosques and shrines, severely throttling all religious practice, and forcing camp detainees to renounce their faith. The leaked documents also show that Xi Jinping himself, the so-called president, not elected by the people, of course, but Xi Jinping himself directed the crackdown, saying that the Communist Party must put, quote, the organs of dictatorship to work and show absolutely no mercy in dealing with the Uyghurs and other Muslims. In one speech, President Xi said, and I quote, the weapons of the people's democratic dictatorship must be wielded without any hesitation or wavering. Continuing the quote, in February 2017, he told thousands of police officers and troops standing at attention in a vast square in Urumqi to prepare for a smashing, obliterating offensive, which is exactly what they have done. According to to documents obtained again by the New York Times, Communist Party officials who were reluctant to carry out Xi Jinping's draconian and horrific policies were themselves investigated and expunged. Quote, secret teams of investigators traveled across the region, identifying those who were not doing enough. 2017, the party opened more than 12,000 investigations. Madam Speaker, we cannot be silent. Xi Jinping is smashing and obliterating an entire people. He is presiding over a
Gentleman's
genocide.
time's expired. Gentleman from California.
I yield 1 minute to a woman who's dedicated literally decades of her life to fighting for human rights, particularly in China, the distinguished Speaker of the House, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Pelosi.
Distinguished speakers recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank him and Mr. McCall and Mr. Engel, members of the chairman, ranking member, and senior member of the Foreign Affairs Committee for bringing this important legislation to the floor. It's an honor to be here with all of you, with Mr. Swazi, who's been a champion for religious rights throughout the world. And Mr. Smith and I go back decades in our fight for human rights in China, whether it's Tibet, whether it's in Beijing, whether it's in Hong Kong. The list goes on and on. I thank you for your ongoing leadership, Mr. Smith. And I also thank the chairman of the committee, Mr. McGovern, chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, and chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. Mr. Smith is the ranking member of that China Executive Commission on China. Thank you, Mr. Lee. Mr. Smith, today in this House of Representatives, in a very strong bipartisan way, we are sending a message to the persecuted that they are not forgotten. We're saying to the President of China, you may tell these people that they are forgotten, but they aren't. And on the floor of the House of Representatives, on a bipartisan, bicameral legislation, we are here. We are here in support of the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, strong bipartisan legislation to address and defend the rights and dignity of the Uyghur people from China's oppression. Today, again, we're sending that message, even as we're heartbroken as to what the Chinese people are suffering in terms of COVID-19 and that crisis. We all are sad about that. But I thank Chris Smith, again, Mr. Engel, Mr. McCall, Mr. Senator Rubio, also for his leadership on this legislation. He has been a champion working with us on the China issues. Beijing's barbarous actions targeting the Uyghur people are an outrage to the collective conscience of the world. Across the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the Uyghur people and other Muslim minorities face brutal oppression, as Mr. Smith was pointing out. A pervasive state of mass surveillance and predictive policing used to discriminate and violate the human rights of minorities. A mass incarceration of more than 1 million, and that is a small number, a very conservative small number, of innocent people with beating, solitary confinement, deprivation of food and medical treatment. The number is probably much larger than that. Forced sterilization and other forms of torture, incidents of mass shootings, extrajudicial killings, and the intimidation and suppression of journalists courageously exposing the truth. Today, with this overwhelming bipartisan legislation, the United States Congress is taking a firm step to counter Beijing's horrific human rights abuses against the Uyghurs. In the House, when brought to the floor in December, this legislation passed on nearly unanimous basis. And in the Senate, it passed under unanimous consent with more than 50 co-sponsors on both sides of the aisle. This legislation helps uncover the truth, requiring reports by the Director of the National Intelligence, State Department, and FBI about the depths of the crisis and about China's campaign against journalists exposing the facts. It creates accountability and ensures transparency of Chinese and foreign companies involved in the camps. Chinese and foreign companies involved in these camps. And it engages the full firepower of American law and leadership, including by urging the application of targeted sanctions against those involved in the oppression of the Uyghur people. We must continue to raise a drumbeat and shine a light of abuse perpetrated by Beijing against the Uyghurs whenever we can, from this House floor to the State Department, to other multilateral institutions. Last Friday, as Speaker, I had the honor of appointing Nuri Turkel, a human rights champion who was born in a camp in Xinjiang region, I had the privilege of appointing him to the United States Commission on International Freedom, largely focused with Ambassador Brownback's leadership on freedom of religion in many countries. There I am confident that he will continue to be a powerful voice for the Uyghur people and for the cause of justice around the world. In just over a week, just think of it, Mr. Smith, in just over a week, the global community will mark the solemn milestone of 31 years since the Tiananmen Square massacre, when students, workers, and citizens were gunned down as they peacefully defied an oppressive regime to demand their liberties and human rights. Sadly, today, Beijing's human rights abuses blatantly continue, targeting so many, from the decades-long abuse faced by the Tibetan people. Many of us have visited Tibet and seen firsthand what is happening there. In Hong Kong's fight for democracy and the rule of law, which have once again been targeted in recent days in a very shameful way, and to the jailing of journalists, human rights lawyers, Christians, and democracy advocates on the mainland, throughout the mainland. To honor those all who have been persecuted, we must renew our commitment to speaking out against China's human rights. If we do not speak out, if America does not speak out against human rights in China because of some commercial interest, then we lose all moral authority to speak out on human rights any place, human rights violations any place in the world. It's a challenge to our conscience. We must do the right thing. And that's what we're doing today. In honor of the millions fighting for their dignity, safety, and the rights in China and around the world, I strongly urge a bipartisan vote for the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. I thank those, again, responsible, Mr. McCall, Mr. Engel, Mr. Sherman, Mr. Smith, members of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Swazi, who's been a champion, as I say, on religious freedom throughout the world. And I want to further close by commending Mr. McGovern again for being relentless and persistent in terms of shining a bright light on human rights violations throughout the world, and especially in China. With that, Madam Chair, and I vote and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, I have no additional speakers, so I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
I yield 3 minutes to an advocate for human and religious rights, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi.
Gentleman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Congressman Smith, thank you so much for your good work and your partnership on this issue. Thank you to Chairman McGovern, and thank you to Speaker Pelosi for her leadership on all issues human rights. Madam Speaker, I rise in strong support of the bipartisan Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which holds the Chinese Communist Party accountable for the horrific treatment of Uyghur Muslim minorities, including forced labor camps in Western China. Over 1 million Uyghurs in mass internments who are subjected to systemized brainwashing, Big Brother-like surveillance, and gross violations of their religious freedom. Since President Nixon went to China in 1971, most Americans have believed that with increased economic integration and exposure to our system of democracy and our way of life, that China would become more like us. Clearly, that has not happened. Not only does the Chinese Communist Party reject any real steps towards democracy, withhold information from the world community regarding the coronavirus, continue its unfair trade practices, and cheat by stealing our intellectual property, but it continually violates human rights, as we have seen not only in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, but also in Tibet with the Buddhists, and in Hong Kong with the students and the journalists. Representative Chris Smith from New Jersey and I originally introduced legislation regarding abuse of the Uyghurs in November of 2018. And while it's taken too long, it's never too late to speak out for human rights and penalize China for its egregious violations. Madam Speaker, Uyghur families are prohibited from practicing their faith. They're often separated from their family members and prohibited from reading the Quran and making their daily prayers. And in some instances, they're forced to eat pork during Ramadan. The so-called re-education camps in China, where Uyghurs are forced to work in textile or manufacturing jobs in or near mass internment camps, are not only repugnant to our values, but also taint global supply chains. The brutal religious-based persecution of the Uyghurs in China is alarming, but not new. China has continued to repress anyone who does not conform to their system, including Tibetans, Christians, and the people of Hong Kong. Just last week in Hong Kong, the Chinese Communist Party proposed national security legislation that would erode Hong Kong's autonomy and civil liberties. We must remain vigilant. This bill holds the Chinese Communist Party and Politburo members like Shen Chuanguo accountable for their abuses. I urge my colleagues to support the passage of this important bipartisan legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, I continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee, an advocate for human rights.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Madam Speaker, thank you for your indulgence.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from California for his leadership. I thank Mr. Smith for his leadership as well, and the gentleman from Texas, my colleague, for their leadership, and listening to the Speaker for her continued years of leadership. The treatment of Uyghurs in China, which warranted the call for the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, S3744, the treatment is of such volcanic, mammoth proportions that we cannot even describe it on this floor. We in America take our faith so seriously. We are gratified that whatever our faith is, and whatever the time that we have for our particular faith, whether we go to confession as Catholics, whether or not we take communion, as many faiths do, whether we honor Easter as a special moment for Christians of resurrection, whether or not we know the Passover and the specialness of that, or whether as Muslims we know Ramadan, we are clearly ones that understand how much faith is a part of our life. Can you imagine being in a country that brutalizes you because you practice your faith, keeps you from reading the very book that gives you faith and inspiration, the Quran, and then doing the most dastardly act, which is to separate you from your families? Of course, many of us know Ramadan just finished and Eid on Saturday. Americans who are Muslims had the opportunity to do and practice their faith and share with their families without recrimination and violence. Just imagine a Uyghur in China, fearful of your life and not having the ability to practice your faith. As one of my colleagues said, the worst, forcing you to eat pork and continuing to subject you to penalties and punishment. So I rise to support this legislation because we can do nothing less but to support the Human Rights Policy Act for the Uyghurs and bring them out of the terrible tragedy of oppression in China. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm prepared to close if the gentleman from California is.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Just today, Secretary of State announced under the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act that we passed last November, which requires an annual certification of Hong Kong's autonomy. He just announced that he cannot certify the autonomous nature of Hong Kong. This is a very significant day, Madam Speaker, because the Chinese Communist Party now has cracked down on the freedom-loving people of Hong Kong and their autonomous nature under one country, two systems. Back when the UK Sino Pact was signed, the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, are in violation now of the Sino-UK Pact. Madam Speaker, this bill, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, is more proof that we can't come together as Republicans and Democrats to address the generational threat by the Chinese Communist Party and champion American values. Whether it be the Muslim population of the Uyghurs, whether it be the Tibetan population who have been persecuted, and the Dalai Lama who is in exile, to the Christians who are persecuted in China by the Communist Party, this bill will help hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for their atrocities and will show the world, including the Uyghur Muslim American community, that the United States Congress will not tolerate these appalling human rights violations. We will always stand for human rights across the globe. And the one thing I respect about our committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, is that we stand together when it comes to our foreign policy. As Chairman Engel often says, partisanship stops at the water's edge. And when it comes to human rights, we stand with our founding fathers and what they stood for in fighting oppression and tyranny and for democracy and freedom. And that is why today we stand with the Uyghur Muslim population in China. And for all those listening in China, and particularly to those members of the Chinese Communist Party who are probably watching this broadcast on C-SPAN, we are watching you. We are watching you today. And we will not back down. We will talk about this until it stops. And it will stop, hopefully in our lifetime. It won't stop this Congress, but it must stop. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California.
Having no further speakers, I yield myself as much time as I may consume for the
Gentleman's
purpose of
recognized.
closing. The bill before us represents a number of different bills in the Senate and the House, all of which have been blended together. All of these bills contain important complementary measures to counter one of the most important human rights of the present day, the detention of over 1 million Uyghurs and other Muslims in Xinjiang province of China. In particular, as chair of the Asia Subcommittee, back in February of last year, I joined with our ranking member, Ted Yoho, and Congressman Conley and Congresswoman Wagner in introducing the Uyghur Act. It is from that legislation to this added to this bill the imposition of sanctions on individuals and entities found to have committed gross human rights abuses against Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and members of other Muslim minority groups and other persons in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. This bill, I should point out, is not one that just expresses the view of Congress, not one that just demands reports be issued by the State Department to refocus the world on what is going on to the Uyghurs and others. This bill imposes sanctions on those responsible. The Chinese Communist Party has sought to erase the distinct Uyghur Muslim culture and religious traditions through mass detentions, re-education, and a coordinated campaign called Strike Hard Against, quote, violent extremism, launched in 2014. Thanks to leaked Communist Party of China documents, we now know the impetus of this campaign came from the highest levels of the party. In April of 2014, the General Secretary Xi Jinping ordered party officials to, and here's his words, show absolutely no mercy in using the organs of dictatorship to suppress Muslim minorities. More than 1 million Uyghurs have been imprisoned, and they've been imprisoned because, in the words of the Chinese Communist Party, their thinking has been infected by unhealthy thoughts. It appears, according to the Chinese Communist Party, a dedication to religion or to freedom and democracy is unhealthy and justifies incarceration. Along with the re-education camps, the Strike Hard campaign has also involved high-tech surveillance and monitoring the Uyghurs, monitoring and suppressing Muslim religious practice, including funeral practices, the suppression of the Uyghur language, and the party has acted beyond the borders of China, intimidating Chinese Muslim minorities who are living abroad, preventing them, including some who are permanent residents of the United States, from leaving the Xinjiang region. The legislation before us is an important start, but it is just a start in our efforts to counter Chinese repression of its Muslim minorities. I think I have already highlighted the sanctions in this bill. In particular, the bill requires the President to block assets of and deny and revoke visas with respect to any foreign person, including a Chinese government official, who are determined to be responsible for the suppression and inhumane treatment of Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities in Xinjiang province. So I want to thank Chairman Engel of the Foreign Affairs Committee, who has put together the most bipartisan committee in either house of Congress. Ranking Member McCall, who's been an important part of that. Speaker Pelosi, who spoke to us earlier. Our colleagues Chris Smith and Tom Suozzi, who have spoken to us earlier as well. Senators Mark Rubio, Robert Menendez, my colleague in running the Asia Subcommittee, Ted Yoho, as well as Jerry Conley and Ann Wagner, and everyone else who has been involved in this legislation. And I hope that that we will see the Muslim countries, particularly in the world, but all countries, be willing to stand up to Beijing and speak out against this human rights travesty. I yield back.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 3744? All in favor say aye. Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative.
Madam Speaker?
Gentleman from California.
On that vote, I request the yeas and nays.
Pursuant to Section 3 of House Resolution 965, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on the question are postponed. The yeas are 413, the nays are 1, 2/3 being in the affirmative. The rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.